following program is brought to you by the University of Alabama.
Frye Gaillard, winner of the 2012 Clarence Kaysen Award for Distinguished Nonfiction, is the author of more than 20 books on subjects ranging from NASCAR to Jimmy Carter to the effects of Hurricane Katrina on South Alabama, especially Biola Battery. His best-known book, however, may be his fine history of the civil rights movement in Alabama, Cradle of Freedom, Alabama and the Movement That Changed America. I spoke with Frye Gaillard in our studio in Reese Pfeiffer Hall on the campus of the University of Alabama. Frye, it's nice to see you again.
Good to see you, Don.
Thank you for coming in today.
Yes, sir.
Today's a very exciting day for you, and you have my congratulations. You are this year's winner of the Clarence Kaysen Award. That is a pretty big deal.
It's a huge deal to me for all kinds of reasons. I mean, I think Clarence Kaysen was one of the people in Alabama who kind of helped set the standard for literary journalism or literary nonfiction, whatever you want to call it, something that all of the winners of the award have tried to do. So it's a very aptly named award. And then, when I look at the company that I'm suddenly in, it's pretty cool.
It really is. I've been looking at that list myself recently. Yeah. 6 of the people on that list have the Pulitzer Prize.
Pulitzer Prize, yeah.
And E.O. Wilson has 2.
Well, maybe I can take one of his.
He has an extra
balance it
one.
Out. Yeah, okay, good.
That prize is given for distinguished work in nonfiction to a person with strong Alabama connections, and yours are perfectly strong. You are a native son. You're a Mobilian, right?
That's correct. I grew up in Mobile, lived there in the same house in the same neighborhood until I went off to college, it was the intent of my family that I follow in the line of lawyers that started with my grandfather. My father was a judge. I had an uncle who was a lawyer. It was just assumed that I would be one too, and happily my grades in college weren't conducive to law school, so I had to do something.
Your family is you're not just from Mobile. Your family's been there a long time, if I'm not mistaken.
That's correct.
French name?
French name. My family got off the boat in Charleston, South Carolina in 1680 or thereabouts, and then the Alabama branch came to Monroe County in 1830. My great-great-grandfather had been a politician in South Carolina, and he ran afoul of John C. Calhoun. He was on the opposite side of some issues, and it didn't bode well for his political career there. So off he came to Alabama and settled in Monroe County, and then he moved to Mobile in 1850. So that's when my family got to Mobile.
That is a while.
It is. It's
even among fine old families, that's a long while.
Right.
You must have received a certain amount of pressure to come up to Tuscaloosa to go to school, but you didn't. You went up to Vanderbilt.
Right.
And that, as college often does, changed your life.
It really did. It was a very interesting time to be in college. 1964 to 1968, I was there. And really 2 things happened that were crucial for me there. One is that I went and joined the staff of the Vanderbilt student newspaper. I had never really thought about being a journalist, but I had friends who were on the newspaper staff. And there was this sudden realization with that it was a cool thing to do. You had license to ask all these impertinent questions. You could, and to be more serious about it, it was a chance to ask interesting people about their lives, and
right.
it was just like the scales fell away, and I thought, wow, this is really fun to do. And then the other thing was that it was being in college in that part of the 1960s. It was such a turbulent, tumultuous time. The civil rights movement, the war in Vietnam, the protests against the war in Vietnam. And I had an English professor who called my attention to the William Faulkner acceptance speech for the Nobel Prize, where he talked about the human heart in conflict with itself being the only thing worth writing about. And it wasn't much of a leap to say, well, collectively, our human heart is in conflict with itself in the South these days. And so I knew when I got out of college that I wanted to write about those kinds of things.
Yeah. I wouldn't be surprised at all if we had William Faulkner here to ask if it was the Southern human heart in conflict with itself that he was actually most talking about.
Well, I think certainly he set most of his own explorations of that larger subject in the South. That was the place that resonated for him in terms of considering that larger question. So, as has happened for so many writers in the South, there are no surprise that this region has been rich in literature.
Well, looking at your resume, after a couple of wrinkles, Southern was it the Southern, not the Southern Poverty Law Center, but
the Race Relations Information Center
in Tennessee.
Nashville, yeah.
You moved on to Charlotte, where you then spent more than 20 years.
Right.
Charlotte, it seems, a lot of people don't think about Charlotte at all. It's not Paris, it's
right.
Charlotte.
Right.
But when one does consider it at a little bit more length, that was a place where a lot of interesting and odd cultural stuff was going on. And looking back, you had, for example, one of your first books had to do with the desegregation of the schools and the huge busing conflict.
Right. Charlotte was the national test case for busing. And I went to Charlotte to work for the newspaper there. The Charlotte Observer, especially in the early 70s, was considered one of the best places that you could stop on your way, I assume, to the New York Times or Washington Post or whatever.
Right.
But once I got to Charlotte, there was so much interesting stuff going on, and then after a while I had kids that I couldn't take with me if I'd left, so it turned out to be a great place to stay and just kind of dig in. The busing controversy was one that I was assigned to cover starting in 1972. And really, it was a city trying to come to terms with itself, trying to say, what kind of place is this? And busing caused Charlotte to ask really basic questions about the nature of its heart and mind and soul, I think. Yeah. So it was very interesting assignment.
I know it is, and it made it the dream long deferred.
Right.
Made a very interesting and important book. This is just a coincidence, but I was actually in Boston in 1975, living, and they were having the same kind of thing in Boston. The South, people were being bussed into South End, and people were being bussed, and
it was really
the Irish and black neighborhoods, and everybody just was crazy.
Yeah, it was quite a scene in Boston, and there was this man bites dog story of some kids from the South, from Charlotte, going up to Boston to try to talk to people about how to make it work. So Charlotte did a pretty good job with that issue for a while.
Right.
Later, not so much, but at first they did pretty well.
Well, we talk about how history will be the judge of some of these things, and I'm not sure even now, 30 years later, what the judgment on some of those issues was. It was a mess. It was chaos and bad feelings, and whether it was a good idea or not I don't think it's settled.
Right.
You said that Charlotte would come to terms with its soul. That reminds me of, God help me, Jim and Tammy Faye Baker, who had their headquarters there.
They had their headquarters in Charlotte, and it became obvious fairly soon that in addition to the question of this form of religion and TV evangelism and that whole phenomenon, that there was also the question of how they were raising and spending money. And the Charlotte Observer dug into the finances of PTL, and eventually, you know, Jim Baker resigned because of the Observer's work. I was in the kind of the front end of that. I did not do the story that won the Pulitzer Prize for the Observer later on, but it was a really interesting subject to cover for a while.
Many years ago, you and I talked about the Bakers, just for a few minutes. And my impression then, and I'll bring it up now for you to have another go at, my impression then was that you were fonder of them, or more, in my opinion, more generous to them than I ever would have been. You saw something, maybe you saw something more genuine there than other people saw?
Well, particularly with Jim Baker, I thought that Jim Baker was a person. First of all, he was not part of the religious right, which was taking off at that time. He voted for Jimmy Carter for president. He was so there was a certain kind of generosity of spirit, I thought, in the political implications of his faith. Secondly, he was a very amiable guy, and I thought was sincere in his faith. What the problem I always thought was his theology. It was very shallow, and you know, anybody that stands before the camera and says to a family that had just prayed for a Winnebago and gotten one, he says, "Praise God, and when you pray for a Winnebago, pray for the exact color that you want." You know,
Go on.
I mean, that's a true quote, and theologically, I couldn't quite, you know, accept that. But I did think that there was a certain genuineness with him at the start, but it got out of control with the money, and it just, and they did eventually cross the line into criminality. There's no question about it.
Well, they became very famous.
Right.
And he went to
went
jail.
to prison. Yeah.
She did not, I guess.
Right. That's correct.
Right. He voted for Jimmy Carter, and that, of course, it gives me the perfect bridge, and that is you, Jimmy Carter. I watch way too much television, and I'm startled at how many times someone will be on television. It doesn't have to be Fox News. It can be a lot of different places, and they will talk about him and his presidency as like the nadir of the American White House.
Right.
And I don't get it. You are a fan. I mean, you're an admirer of President Carter.
Yeah, I thought that I still don't believe that the national media or that national politicians have understood the Carter presidency in the way that I think it should be understood. I mean, Carter. There were some remarkable achievements, the Camp David Accords, and even bringing the hostages home from Iran was something that, if you know the backstory of it and how that happened, it was a remarkable achievement, even though it probably cost Carter his job because it took too long.
Right.
Whatever you think of Carter's presidency, his post-presidency has been one of the fine stories in American history, I think, and so that was something that I got interested in covering while I was in Charlotte, partly because of Carter's involvement with Habitat for Humanity.
Right.
Charlotte had a very strong chapter, and Carter came to Charlotte, and that's where I met him at a Habitat for Humanity build in Charlotte.
Right.
The first meeting was not all that auspicious. We were working on a house together, and he looked at me as I was trying to hang a piece of drywall, and he said, with no trace of humor that I could detect, he said, "You haven't done this much, have you?" And it was Carter was a very good carpenter. I was all thumbs, and so we had nowhere to go but up after that first conversation. But I really did enjoy writing about Carter and getting to know him a little bit.
Do you have any feelings about how future historians of the next 20 years will reevaluate him? Are we hopeful there?
Well, I am, but I'm particularly hopeful that the example he set in his post-presidency will become a standard that other presidents, former presidents, try to measure themselves by. I think Bill Clinton's already trying to do that, and I think that others will as well. I mean, you look at his work for peace, for the eradication of diseases in distant corners of the third world. His work monitoring elections in troubled places. I mean, all of those things are situations that play to Carter's strengths. Carter is a very strong-willed guy. He's a very stubborn guy, personally fearless, and very idealistic about these kinds of issues. Yeah. So, interesting.
Well, from the sublime to the ridiculous, I guess, although I'm sure lots of people would disagree. You also covered NASCAR.
I did.
And Charlotte is, if it's not the national hub of NASCAR,
it's pretty close to being to NASCAR what Nashville is to country music. Pretty close to that.
Right. And you spent how many months did you spend with Kyle Petty, the driver?
I spent a little over a year with Kyle Petty and his team going through the 1992 and part of the 1993 season with them, and it was an experience that I initially did for money. I had left the Charlotte Observer. I was looking for an advance to write a book. St. Martin's Press wanted a book on that subject, and I didn't have any particular expertise or even much interest, but I liked the sound of the advance, and so I agreed to do the book. But then I became very interested in the Petty family, and it started out with the first conversation that Kyle Petty and I had. I was explaining to him why I thought he should agree to this, and what I wanted him to agree to was for me to hang around, take notes on everything that happened for a year, write about it with him having no editorial control over what I wrote. Right. I'm not sure I would have said yes to that if I'd been him, but he said yes immediately. I told him what I wanted to do. He said, yeah, let's do it, he said. Really? That's the way he kind of talked. And I said, well, I've got a longer speech I can give about this if you want. He said, no, I want to do this. Well, it turned out that the reason was he was willing to talk to me about race cars if I would talk to him about books. Oh. Kyle Petty was one of the most, and I guess still is, one of the most voracious readers I've ever known. He said, yeah, I usually read about 2 or 3 books a week, he said. I said, 2 or 3 a week? I don't read 2 or 3 a week. He said, yeah, no, every at least that. And I said, well, what are you reading? And he said, well, I just finished Invisible Man, he said. You ever read that? And it's just kind of, I was not my stereotype.
I'd be startled.
Go fast and turn left. That's what I thought they were interested in. But he was a very, very bright guy.
There must be a lot of long evenings in motel rooms, seriously, on the road, going from one race to the next. Yeah. George Plimpton, somebody who figures large in your career plan, so to speak. This sounds like a Plimpton project.
Well, it was, except that I didn't actually get in a car and drive it like he did. So, with the paper lion or whatever, where he actually got out on the football field.
All kinds of things, yeah.
But I did kind of hang with the team and try to figure out what's going on here, and for one thing, I came to appreciate the fact that it's a team sport. It doesn't appear to be when you look at it on TV, but it is, and it's a sport, or was then, where there was a very strong connection between the fans and the drivers. And again, the Pettys were instrumental in that. Richard Petty was always so accessible to ordinary people, and so there was something kind of nice about that.
By the way, if you had gotten behind the wheel and Kyle Petty had been in the driver's seat and you had driven around the track, he would have said exactly what Jimmy Carter said.
That's true.
That's true. You haven't done this much before.
He would have, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, after a long period of time working in Charlotte, you decided to move home to Alabama. You moved back to the Mobile area down south of Mobile.
Right.
And you found, not only did you do it, but since you've been back now 4 years.
Came back in 2005, so it's coming up on 7 years.
Yeah, coming up on 7 years. You found lots to write about.
Yeah, I really have. I came back because of Cradle of Freedom, a book I did on the civil rights movement. And because of that book, I was offered a job at the University of South Alabama as their writer-in-residence.
Right.
And then it turned out, with my impeccable sense of timing, I arrived in Mobile about 2 weeks before Hurricane Katrina. And Nancy and I, my wife and I, had bought a house on Fowl River, a beautiful estuary just south of Mobile, and we got back just in time to wonder if our house was going to blow away. It didn't, but 10 miles from there, in the little town of Biola Battery, which was mentioned in passing in the Forrest Gump movie, but it's a fishing village going back all the way to 1789. 2,000 people of the 2,300 there were driven from their damaged homes by the hurricane. And so I became very interested, first of all, in this place that was trying to survive. The storms immediately, but also changes in the global economy that made it harder for them to make a living from the sea, no matter how hard they worked at it.
Right.
And it was I found it to be such an interesting multicultural place. Blacks, whites, and Asian refugees.
Right.
In about 2/3 white, almost a third Asian, and the rest African American.
Were these Vietnamese?
Vietnamese, Laotian, and Cambodian.
But all from the war in Southeast Asia in some
Southeast
fashion
Asia.
or other.
Yeah, mm-hmm. Yeah,
right.
Yeah. So that was the first story upon coming back that really arrested my attention, and then, there have been others since then, and there's no shortage of stuff in Alabama to write about.
Cradle of Freedom. If we had been having a conversation several months before you began working on that book, one of the questions I would raise,
right.
not an objection,
Mm-hmm.
but simply a query,
Mm-hmm.
is there are a lot of books about the
right.
civil rights movement.
Right.
You have Taylor Branch in 3 gigantic volumes. Right. I mean, there's a lot been said.
Yeah.
But somehow you intuited that the Alabama story was somehow different and somehow not been told quite right.
Well, it seemed to me that what you had Taylor Branch with his 3 enormous volumes telling the national story. In Alabama, you had it broken down into smaller pieces. Diane McWhirter won the Pulitzer Prize for her wonderful book about Birmingham. But the story of Alabama as a whole, it seemed to me, had maybe not been told yet.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing was that I really wanted to bring a storyteller's eye to it as opposed to some kind of theoretical historian's eye. And because it to me was just, it's such a powerful human story, not only the iconic figures like Rosa Parks and Dr. King and those folks, but also all the ordinary people who, in the circumstances they found themselves in, wound up doing extraordinary things. I just couldn't get enough of that story, and to be honest, wanted to write it whether it needed to be written again or not. But,
well, yeah.
But I think there
That's
was
why
a
people
place
do it.
for but I think there was a place for a book that was statewide in its focus. And the response to it, I think, has been pretty good.
Right. And you've written a bit of a follow-up, which is a kind of a civil rights tourism guide to the various places where the most important things happen.
Yeah, and some of the lesser-known things as well.
Right. Right.
So, yeah, it was it seemed to be a natural follow-up, and it was almost like telling the whole story again, except instead of telling it chronologically, you tell it geographically, place by place, what happened. So each stop is not only what there is to see there, but also the backstory of what you're looking at.
Good.
So,
well, I know the press is pleased with it, and I know it's doing well. And the Department of Tourism likes it too.
Well, one of the things that I was told is that one of the main reasons that people come to Alabama as tourists is because of the civil rights sites. Alabama's done a surprisingly good job preserving its physical civil rights history.
I just, I don't make a lot of commentary in this show because I mostly just listen. But I swear I see a paradox here. I mean, the things that happened in Alabama that were so terrible are now being touted by the Department of Tourism and attracting visitors from all over the country.
Well, it is kind of a remarkable thing. The one thing I would say to that is that in addition to it being terrible, there were also heroes in those stories.
Yes, of course.
And so that's one thing to celebrate.
You are as hard working a writer as there is anywhere around. And I know that you've got several projects underway and finished and in various stages of completion. But the one that I'm interested in, we only have a minute left.
Okay.
The one I'm interested in the most is your book on books that you've read that have been important to you. The exact title is?
It's called The Books That Mattered, A Reader's Memoir.
Right.
It comes out in the fall of 2012 from New South Books, and I've had the best time doing it.
What is it?
It's a book that looks. It's 10 essays in which I write about probably a total of 30 books that had an enormous impact on my life. And the hope is that other people will read it and say, well, what about me? You know what? They'll kind of reflect on their own experience as readers, and it's kind of a celebration of literature and literacy, and it was just great.
Well, I have to ask. I need some titles. What are some of the books that have had the greatest impact on your life?
Some of them would be obvious. You know, To Kill a Mockingbird, or All the King's Men, or Ava's Man by Rick Bragg is in there. But some of them are less expected. One of David Halberstam's early books, called The Unfinished Odyssey of Robert Kennedy, was a book I read that just made me think about what you could do as a journalist that also would stray into the realm of literature.
Right. Well, as soon as this book comes out, I will quickly read your book about the important books that you've read.
Please, have at it.
And then I hope you and I will sit again and talk about that.
I will look forward to it if we can.
Thank you, Frye.
Yeah.
This has been a pleasure.
Okay. Me too.